Hey everyone, how's it going? I've had a busy month of March and I've been struggling with a cold a bit, which I know I've not been the only one because when I've gone on the train to work, lots of people have been coughing and snuffling and it's just that time of year. But not only have I been ill sort of with a cold, but also I'm just sick of Brexit in general. Like, I don't know how many people outside of the UK are following this or not, but Brexit is such a big deal here. It's in the news every day and things are changing every day but also not changing every day, so everyone's just exhausted and sick of it, and it's really upsetting, like on both sides of the camp of to leave and remain. Everyone, I think, is just really tired and sick of talking about this, and no resolutions are being made, and the deadline keeps getting pushed back further and further. But that's just a big, like, messy thing that's like happening and consuming everyone's thoughts at the moment. So I'm very happy to escape away to books and talk about books. But also, you know, books aren't just an escape. They're a different way of engaging with politics and the world around us and all that good stuff, you know. So I don't need to explain that to you because you're a smart reader. I've done lots of book prize reading this month from different prizes, mainly from the Women's Prize for Fiction. And I finally assembled the entire long list of books from the long list of the Women's Prize for Fiction. A lot of books here, but at the same time, like, makes me so excited to read and engage with them. So I read a number of books from this list, and then also I have the entire long list for the Man Booker International Prize. And, like, again, these are like all really exciting looking books that I just want to like read and engage with and discover them. And so, you know, I find that really inspiring, and like it really pushes me, you know, that age-old question of how do I read so much. And that's one of the reasons I read so much, because I get so excited by the looks of all these different books. And so I've been mainly reading prize books, but I've also read a couple other books which don't have anything to do with prizes. And I read, I think, 11 books in total. But also, speaking of prizes, one of the exciting things I got to do this month was go to the announcement of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, which, if you don't know, I made a video about it last year, talking about the prize winners for last year. And they select, I think, 8 different winners each year who each of these writers win $165,000 each. So it's one of the richest prizes in the world, but also these writers have no idea that they've been selected for this prize, and they just get a phone call out of nowhere and say, hey, you've won this prize, here's $165,000. It's quite amazing. Usually this prize ceremony is held at Yale in America, but this year they decided to do the announcement in the UK, and so it was so wonderful. I got to go to this prize ceremony, and I had no idea who had won the prize, or I thought, like, oh, I might not know any of these 8 winners of the prize, so it was slightly nerve-wracking in that way, though I got to go to the prize ceremony with Anna-Marie Crowhurst, the writer of, who's a wonderful person and wrote the amazing, like, fun, really intelligent novel, The Illumination of Ursula Flight, which Anna and I talked about in our long list predictions. We were hoping it would be on the Women's Prize list. And she was there at the party, and we were speaking to each other and hanging out for most of the evening. She's such a delight. And also we had this funny thing where well, she has this funny thing where every time she goes to a literary event and Alan Hollinghurst is there, she likes to take these selfies with Alan Hollinghurst in the background. Like, she has such reverence for him. She doesn't want to actually meet him, but she's just so excited to be in his presence. And so we took a couple of selfies because Alan Hollinghurst was there. We took a couple of selfies with him in the background, and so that was just like really funny. So it was wonderful hanging out with her. But also then with the prize announcement, I was so overjoyed, so excited that the Irish writer Danielle McLaughlin, who wrote this short story collection called Dinosaurs on Other Planets, which was published, I think, a few years ago. It's one of my favorite books of the year. It was so good. And she was one of the winners of this prize, and she was there at the ceremony. So it was so funny because I sort of went up afterwards when they were taking pictures on the stage after the announcements were made. I went up to take a picture of them just sort of standing on the side, and Danielle saw me and was just like sort of pointed at me and recognized me and was waving, and I went over and talked to her. I hadn't ever met her before, and so it was so wonderful meeting her and talking with her in person. She's working on a novel at the moment, her first novel, which I'm so excited about, and yeah, I'll be really eager to read that. But was so overjoyed that she won this prize. But also the writer David Chariandy, who wrote this novel called Broder, which I think was published last year and read, and was such a great novel. He was also a winner of the prize, though he wasn't there at the ceremony that evening, so unfortunately didn't get to meet him. But I was so overjoyed to see that they both won this prize, which has given such like a boost, to their confidence, but also to their being able to support themselves and continue doing their amazing writing. So that was just so wonderful to see. Then other things I got to do this month. One of the great things I got to do was interview the author Nora Extena, who wrote the novel Soviet Milk. I got to interview her in person. I was invited to interview her at Westminster Library, and so I made a video last year doing a review of that book, but also sharing my recipe for Latvian bacon and onion rolls, and so. It was so wonderful, being able to talk to her about her really artful, really interesting novel, but also talk about our shared Latvian culture and Latvian history, and and how that history has had such a big impact on Latvian culture, and how the writing has come about. And her novel is all about the last 20 years in the Soviet rule of Latvia. So. Yeah, that was so great. She was so warm and friendly, and she was like inviting me to come to Latvia. She was showing me pictures of her dog on her phone and saying, "You have to come stay with me when you come to Latvia." So that was so sweet and wonderful. I have to cough. I'm going to have to periodically stop and cough throughout this video. Okay, I'm going to cut out my coughs and get that out of the way so I won't be grossly coughing and sniffling on camera. Another exciting thing I got to do this month was I was invited to come read at this event called Novella Umbrella, and they were focusing this month on Sarah Moss's novel Ghost Wall, which is of course long-listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I'd read this last autumn and loved it, and so I was invited to come there and read some of my own fiction, but also we read aloud sections of this novel and discussed it and in a lot of detail. And it was so wonderful reading it aloud because a lot of the humor came out of it. I think it is about a bleak subject and a dark subject of abuse of a girl and her mother by the father, and reactionary politics and a lot of dark subjects. But there's also a lot of funny bits in it as well. Reading it aloud, that really comes out. And so I liked that and enjoyed that experience. Although it was quite an odd experience. It was sort of an odd evening in general. She had set up all these candles to read by candlelight and discuss the book by candlelight. But of course, so it made it very moody and atmospheric, which was wonderful and sort of perfect for this novel. But at the same time, it's quite hard to read in candlelight. So people were reading aloud, but they were like struggling to see the text in front of them. And so yeah, that was sort of funny, but also kind of charming. So yeah, that was really fun. Another really fun thing I got to do this month. Also, I got to go see a production of Dracula at the London Library, which was so interesting because Bram Stoker actually wrote and researched part of his novel Dracula at the London Library. This is a private library in London, and he was a member of it, and yeah, he researched some of his novel there. And so then to see a stage production of his creation, which has gone on to inspire so many different Dracula stories in our culture and has had such a huge influence. To see it right there in the building, that was a lot of fun. Anyway, I'll stop talking about bookish things that I've done this month and start talking about the books that I read this month. So I read A Spell of Winter by Helen Dunmore, which was actually the very first winner of the Women's Prize in 1996, I think, when it was called the Orange Prize and sponsored by Orange, so it was called the Orange Prize. But yeah, it's been the Women's Prize, and it was the very first winner of that prize. So I thought it'd be fun, while also reading the long list for this year's prize, to go back and read Helen Dunmore, which I've never done before. And it was my first experience reading her. And I read this book as a buddy read with Jacqueline from her booktube channel, 6 Minutes for Me. And I've been wanting to do a buddy read with her for a while, and she'd never read Helen Dunmore herself either. So it was sort of fun going into this together, sort of blind, and just experiencing it for the first time. And we did sort of have a similar experience reading it, and it was sort of comforting reading it alongside her, because I was feeling like well, it's not just me feeling these things, but she was feeling them too as she was reading them, because the writing was very beautiful, and there are some wonderful moments of psychological insight in it, where it's the story of a girl and her brother who are basically sort of stranded on this estate back, like, I'm not sure when it's set, like, I think it's sort of before the war, so I think it's like a century ago. And they, their parents are gone. Their father is in an asylum, and their mother has gone to France and is sort of this figure of local scandal, where she, I think, sort of shamefully ran away with a man, or, you know, that's the perception, that she's sort of shamed for doing this. So these children are sort of abandoned to be raised by their grandfather and by a nanny and a tutor on the estate. And they don't really understand what happened to their parents. It's not explained to them. They form this very close bond with each other. And so it's just sort of about the life on this estate with each other. And so there's not a lot that happens in terms of drama or action. It's just these quiet moments of like psychological insight, though there are like big twists in the story, which I wasn't expecting and didn't know was going to happen. But then also, in a way, like it sort of builds up to these moments of suspense. But then I found the ending quite disappointing, because it doesn't really do anything with them. It just sort of deflates and nothing much happens. It's strange, because like parts of it really reminded me of Marilyn Robinson's novel Housekeeping, which is a novel I love. I think it's so beautiful and insightful, and it's sort of about what the meaning of home is, and the meaning of our families are, and what our connections are with our family, and do our families make our home, or is home something that's internal that we find in ourselves? And so I think this book asks a lot of those questions, but it's difficult, I think, to really understand Kathy. It's all told through the daughter Kathy's perspective, of what really you're supposed to make of that. Like, I just sort of finished the novel scratching my head a bit, wondering like, well, what am I supposed to take away from this? But so yeah, I'm not totally sure what to think about it, but I did really enjoy the experience, and especially the experience buddy reading it. So yeah, that was fun and interesting. I also read this book of short stories, Friday Black, which has been talked about a lot. It came out last year at some point, and a lot of people have been talking about it and discussing it. I've heard really mixed opinions about it, on people who are a bit disappointed by it, and other people who think it's really great. So I was really curious to see what I would make of these stories myself. And this is also prize nominated. It is nominated for the Dylan Thomas Prize this year. And so, yeah, these are short stories. And to be honest, I think it's sort of a mixed bag. Some of the stories are really strong, and some of them are a bit weaker and more about sort of the ideas for a story than really well-executed story itself. But they're all quite like high concept, sort of surreal type tales, which do like sort of blend into it's almost like this exaggerated representation of reality, dealing with all sorts of different political and social issues in America, and it does that really inventively. So like the title story, Friday Black, is this play upon this great American tradition, or what's become this great American commercial tradition of Black Friday every year, the day after Thanksgiving, when there are big sales in the shops. And you know, in recent years, it's become like such a thing where these sales will start at midnight, and everyone queues up to get these enormous bargains, and they fight and claw each other to try to get these items on sale before they run out. And he exaggerates that to the point where it becomes hugely violent, where people are actually killing each other, and all the customers become these sort of insensible zombies, like wandering around trying to get these items and fighting and clawing and killing each other to get them. And it's told from the perspective of a shop assistant who is witnessing this and who knows how to sell to these people and try to cause minimum amount of damage. And they, because the customers have become so zombie-like, they're really unintelligible. They speak this odd language, but he understands that language, and so he can find the items that they want. And yeah, so it's very sort of oddball, and it's sort of, so it's quite like playful and funny in that way, but also quite serious in that, like, one of the stories too deals with a young man who works at a camp where it's this like sort of virtual reality situation where people can kill other people, specifically people of color who like just walk past their houses, and so it becomes this virtual reality game where you can kill people, and it's sort of presented. The company presents it like it's this sort of moral dilemma, and it's teaching people how to deal with these real world moral dilemmas. But in reality, it's, you know, them sort of indulging in their prejudices and in their violent anger to want to kill people who are different from them. But at the same time, it's told from the perspective of a man who works there and who is killed continuously by these people. But you know, in this virtual game, but who does it because it's a good job and it's getting a salary. So what I really enjoyed and appreciated these stories was how it shows this, a lot of them show this sort of working class perspective of people who are like struggling to get by and who have to compromise their values continuously and their morality because of, you know, they need a job in order to survive. And I think it portrays that really well in some of the stories. But then some of the stories are like a bit more, the kind of the exaggeration he goes to doesn't quite work as well. Like there's one man whose girlfriend gets an abortion and who was going to have twins, and her twins are aborted, and the fetuses of these twins come to sort of haunt this man physically as they are. These aborted fetuses come to him, and I just felt like it just didn't really work as well. I could understand the message he was making and the moral dilemma of this whole situation, but yeah, it just didn't really work for me. And a couple of the other stories were like that, how it was sort of, and some of them get oddly repetitive, but yeah, really interesting book of short stories that I'm so glad I read this, enjoyed, and I think he's like an incredible talent. I'll be really interested to read what he writes next. And I read Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by the winner of the Man Booker International Prize last year, and it's been longlisted for the prize this year, which I talked about in the video I made about the long list for the Man Booker International Prize. So I won't talk about it a lot here, but it's just to say and reiterate again, because I didn't really get along with her novel Flights last year, and I gave up on reading it. But this novel I really got into and enjoyed so much because the main character is such an oddball that I just enjoyed her oddballness and weird perspective of the world. And also this has a sort of plot that goes through the whole book. It's sort of a mystery plot where people keep dying in her village, and it's the question of what's happening to them. And she sort of comes up with this crackpot theory that it's the local animals that are taking their revenge and killing these different individuals. So yeah, really enjoyed this book. It's very thoughtful and insightful too. Wonderful little insights into it. And also about the process of translation. I mean, you know, it's the International Prize, so this is all translated literature, and there's a section in this which is talking about the trouble of translation, because she and this other young man who she's friends with translate the poetry of Blake together and the journals of Blake together, and she goes into this whole section of the difficulty of translation, and sort of there was a funny thing in it where, you know, because this has been translated into English, and so she's talking about the difficulty of translating a poem from English then into Polish, but then of course this has been translated from Polish into English, and so, you know, there's these different removes of translation, which sort of words, the meaning of words have been sort of changed as they've gone back and forth between these languages. So I just think that's sort of interesting and odd, you know, as an English reader, reading this in English, having been translated. So yeah, it's just a funny point I wanted to make about the book. Now, another novel I read from the Man Booker International Prize list was The Pine Islands by Marion Poschmann, who's a German writer. And so this novel, she's written, I think, 4 novels, and this is her first novel to be translated into English. And I think it won a German prize a couple of years ago, this novel. And and I just, it's a fairly short novel. I just sort of wanted to dive into it, not really knowing much about it or the reception of it or what I might think of it at all. And I mostly found this really funny novel in how it's portraying this particular type of like egotistical type man who just sort of thinks the world revolves around him and acts in this very arrogant and misogynistic way. And so it begins with, he has this dream that his wife has cheated on him, and it was just a dream, but he accuses her of it, and she denies it, and there's no physical evidence that she's cheated on him, but he accepts it as truth because he dreamed it. And so he argues with her and in quite like a violent way, and then leaves her and goes to Japan and just takes off and goes to Japan to follow in the trail of the poet Basho when he traveled around the north of Japan, visiting these different beautiful locations, writing different haiku poems. And so he follows in that trail and writes his own haikus and tries to get in touch with who he is. And and there's this tradition of men who go to find themselves, and I guess it's sort of like a midlife crisis type thing of men who sort of abandon their lives and go to try to find themselves. And I find that sort of endearingly funny in a way because it's I think it's sort of slightly ridiculous and pig-headed but so like it's also quite like horrible in a way, but it's also, I mean, it's understandable that people as they go on in their lives find that maybe their life isn't the way that they wanted it exactly, and so she takes this issue seriously, but at the same time sort of poking fun at his arrogance and his striving for profundity, going to these different locations and having this experience in a foreign land. And also he's a scholar of beards and the history of beards and how they're portrayed in film and art. And so it's also dealing with these ideas about masculinity and what makes a man. And he has these quite crackpot theories, like he has these ridiculous ideas about how homosexuals have interpreted beards and how they idolize sort of smoothness. And I mean, obviously I'm not that way because I have a beard and have had one for like, I think about 10 years or so. But yeah, so it's sort of funny how she's poking fun of him, but sort of taking him quite seriously at the same time. And I sort of wish that she had amplified this anger that I think the author really has about this type of man, and showed that a bit more, rather than just showing him in a sympathetic light where the actual narrative of the novel becomes like his musings about these beautiful locations that he's passing through and these observations he's making about life. So I wish the like ethereal voice had maintained a bit more distance from him. And so you could see the distinction a bit more, whereas at the end it just sort of all blends together and just becomes about his point of view and his thinking he comes to this moment of revelation. So yeah, it didn't entirely work for me, but I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was an interesting different perspective. And then I read a whole bunch of novels on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction. These were 5 different books I read from the long list. So there's An American Marriage, which was obviously been a big bestseller in America. It was an Oprah Winfrey's book club pick, and yeah, it's been a big bestseller, and a lot of people have talked about it. And I felt like I was almost at a slight disadvantage going into this because I just recently, I talked about in my wrap-up last month, I'd read James Baldwin's novel, If Beale Street Could Talk. And this novel basically takes the same plot line of that, where a young couple who have a very promising future together and who are both African-American, the man of that couple is accused of a crime that he almost certainly didn't commit, and of raping a woman, and is incarcerated for that. And so it's about the sort of fallout of that. Both of these novels take that as their plot line. So superficially, it's quite the same, but actually how Tayari Jones executes it is quite different in that it's told mainly in the form of letters of them writing back and forth to each other in prison. And it's not so much about this odious situation that he's in where he's been falsely accused of a crime. I mean, it is about that, and obviously that has a huge impact on their lives. But it's more about how they have this sort of antagonistic relationship. And it's interesting. I find it really interesting because I know couples like this who are quite spiky with each other, who argue like almost constantly, but then they stay together, and there's obviously like a strong love there. But yeah, they just sort of argue quite frequently. And this is quite alien to me because I really love calm, stable relationships, and the relationship I have with my partner, we barely ever argue. And so I find it interesting when couples are able to stay together, but while still having, these big arguments with each other. And so, in this couple, they had that kind of relationship before this crime even happened. They had these big arguments all the time, and they continue as they write letters to each other. And I find it so interesting writing fiction that's told in the form of letters, because you can sort of see how someone's telling their own point of view, but slightly manipulating the situation in their favor, and how they want the other person who's reading the letter to react. And we as a reader can sort of see that a bit more objectively, whereas they don't, I think, quite understand how transparent that is sometimes. So yeah, I found that really interesting, that whole aspect of the novel. And and I just got into their story, and yeah, I was really wondering what was going to happen. So it's quite suspenseful in that way. And I know some people have found this novel a bit disappointing and sort of think of it as just sort of a carbon copy of James Baldwin's novel, but I think it's really different in some striking ways and in interesting ways. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed it overall. Then there is The Pisces by Melissa Broder, which I think has been quite a controversial novel in that, Anna talked about in... oh, actually, no, she didn't actually talk about it, did she, in our video? We did actually talk about it when we made a video discussing what we think might be on the long list, and she talked about how she really disliked this novel, but I cut it out because the video was too long, and so I cut out that whole conversation. But I'm sure I think we will make another video together talking about the shortlist, and yeah, I'm sure we'll have a conversation about this book because I quite liked it and related to it in a lot of different ways. And I understand why some people would have issues with it and problems with it, because she's quite an ugly character, the main character of it. She's not a very sympathetic. Well, no, that's not really right, is it? Because, I mean, I think she is quite sympathetic, but she's quite a nasty person. Her opinions about people, she's not a feminist. She's definitely not a feminist. So, yeah, she has but she also has, very rude opinions about men as well as women. So I think it's sort of a free-for-all of her, like, bad opinions of people. And then, yeah, her actions are quite selfish, and she's quite self-obsessed, and so I think it's sort of sympathetic to like the darker side of our personalities, how we can act this way sometimes, and and also her relentless compulsion to try to find validation in herself in the relationship she has with other men. And yeah, so it's about this young woman who's at university writing a dissertation about Sappho, the poet, but she's not really focused on it. She's more obsessed with this relationship, of the breakup of a long-term relationship that she's had, and she goes to live at her sister's house to house sit for her and watch after her sister's dog, and so try to sort of ground herself and center herself, because she sort of got a bit out of control, and while she's living there, she meets a man who turns out to be a merman by the shore while sitting out on the rocks, and she forms this relationship with him. So it's sort of this fantastical story, but it's really a story about her coming to grips with finding the ability to achieve some self-esteem outside of the relationships she has with men, and rather than, she has these sexual hookups with men that she tries to find validation in, even though she knows that it's sort of illusory, she's not going to find it there. But she still strives to do that anyway. And, and how we can compulsively take these bad actions in our lives, which we know aren't healthy for us, but we do them anyway, because that's just the way that our psychology is made up, and I think it does take that seriously and interesting. But there are parts of it which are quite gross, both in her personality and the awful things she does, but also in the descriptions of the sex that can be quite gross. But it's sort of just dealing with real life. And so, I quite appreciated this novel and enjoyed it, and I'm sure Anna and I are going to have a very interesting conversation about it. And I read these two novels, which I can sort of pair them together because they both are difficult to read in a way because they portray quite horrible violence, sexual violence, and against girls and young women who are forced into situations of slavery. But they do it in very different contexts and very different situations, and the stories have very different tones of narration. So in Praise On for the Butterflies, this takes place in an unnamed African country where Bernice L. McFadden shows this story of a young woman who's taken into slavery because her family comes to believe that or her father specifically and grandmother come to believe that she's a curse on their family, that she's bringing all this bad luck to their family, and the only way to get rid of that sort of curse is to sacrifice the daughter by giving her to this institution which calls itself a sort of religious sanctuary and has a man who is a sort of pseudo-priest at the head of it, but really it's just a sort of farm which is run by slaves, modern-day slaves of these girls who have been from different families who have been taken there as sacrifices because their families are having a difficult situation. She's left in slavery for years in this situation, and it shows her struggle. But this novel has such a lightness of tone of narration, the way it's quite brief, and the way it goes through this story there's really poignant details which are shown, which really open up the story and make me feel that it was real, like I really understood it and could experience it. But it wasn't weighted down in a lot of detail. So it had a great lightness of touch, which I really appreciated and enjoyed, and found it really poignant and moving. But this novel is so interesting because I've heard it talked about on a couple different BookTube channels, where Dee Dee talked about it on her channel, where she said she's a big fan of Bernice L. McFadden. Dee Dee from Brown Girl Reading, her BookTube channel. She's read, I think, all or most of her novels. And she said that she's written another novel, which is basically the same story, so it's quite interesting how I think she's written the same story in a different form. But then also Chris, on his BookTube channel, Chris's Bookish Cauldron, he talked about this novel, how he read a proof of this novel, which is very remarkably different from the final published copy. So in his version of the novel, it's actually set in Ghana, not in a fictional African country, and the main character has a different name. And I think there are some details of it which sound are quite different from how the finished novel was. And so he had some real issues with the book, but I think he had issues with it because it was in this other form. And it would be really interesting to read both of the copies and how the proof compares with the finished copy. And it raises these interesting questions of what is a novel really? Is it the only final finished product, or is it, should we take into account the evolution of a book and how it changed through different versions? And I would normally say that just the finished copy is what we should take into account when reading it. But yeah, I think that's so interesting. So yeah, there's interesting debate to be had from this book. And I also read Remembered by Yvonne Battle-Felton. And this novel, I think this is a debut novel, and her novel is about American slavery and how in the mid-1800s there is a girl who is basically kidnapped, a young African-American girl who lives with a free family. She's free, but then she's stolen and taken into slavery. And it follows the generations of this different family and a family that she gets to know on this plantation. Yeah, it's quite heartrending to read about this subject matter, but it's so interesting how I think she does something so unique in this book, which a lot of authors aren't brave enough to do, is show a character sympathetically who is caught in this situation where she makes some very, what you could say are morally abhorrent decisions and really awful decisions, but it's because she's in this impossible situation. And if you read the book, you'll know who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about. And so I think that's really brave how she did that, because, this is a character which it's difficult to feel sympathy with her in one way because she's doing these horrible things, but at the same time, you understand she's in this horrible situation. So she's doing these things because it's sort of her only option in one way. So, yeah, I'm being quite cryptic, but yeah, I think it would be interesting for you to read this book yourself and understand that. But also, the narration is told from a unique perspective, because the main story is about a young man in the early 1900s who drives a train trolley into a department store. He's a young black man, and then his mother goes to visit him in the hospital, and she's talking about the history of their family and relating to him the history of her family and her experiences being born into a plantation and being born into slavery. And so, yeah, it's a really unique narrative in that way. And the style it's written in is really interesting, but also can be a bit confusing. Like, I found it hard to understand sometimes what was actually going on in the situation. I had to really stop and think about it, which I think is slightly to its detriment. But overall, yeah, really interesting book. Valeria Luiselli's novel Lost Children Archive, which is the first novel which she has written in English. She's written a number of other books, which she's written in Spanish and have been translated in English. And I read Tell Me How This Will End, which is a nonfiction book, and was so powerful. And I went to hear her speak about Lost Children Archive at the South Bank Center. And it was so interesting because she said she's done a lot of work with children who are migrants from Central America and south of North America into the United States. And she's written and been involved with the plight of children who are undocumented and coming to the country seeking refuge, really because living in their own communities has become untenable. And so, yeah, she's written really powerfully about that in that nonfiction book, Tell Me How This Will End. And she said in that interview at the South Bank Center that she felt like she had to write this nonfiction book before she could get to writing this novel and dealing with this subject matter fictionally. So it was more like she had to get the true story out there before writing a fictional story about it and making, really artfully making this story about it. So I think that's such interesting, little insight into her process. And this is another novel which has quite a unique narrative style. How it's told is so interesting in how the first half of the book basically is dealing with this family that's traveling across country. So it's sort of a travelogue novel of their journey across America, where the parents are these sort of sound archaeologists, where they record different sounds in communities as a way of saving perspectives on those different communities. I'm not explaining this very well. It's explained much better in the book, what their jobs are and this sort of artful craft that they have, recording different sounds in these communities and people talking and sharing their stories. So they're traveling across country because they're going to this site where the father wants to record these sounds from the remains of a Native American community. And they bring their two children with them, which are children they had from different relationships. So it's this family that they've sort of formed but at the same time it's breaking apart. So you get this overarching story of the country and what's happening in the country and the migrant children coming into the country, but at the same time it's this personal story about their family which is breaking apart. And I found it so moving and interesting because, like I said, the first half of the novel is told from the mother's perspective, and there's a lot of insights and references from all different literature and stories, and but then the second half of the novel becomes this almost like suspense story of where the children go off on their own, and yeah, and it becomes a bit more hallucinatory and odd. It's so interesting, and all the sort of stories she draws in, like while they're driving across country, they're listening to an audiobook of that famous William Golding novel. What's it called? About the children male children who go on an island and. Oh my gosh, it's such a famous book. I can't remember the name of it. It's so ridiculous. I can't remember the name of the novel. Yeah, what is it? Gosh, the William Golding novel about the children that go onto an island and are shipwrecked on an island, and they form this own society which becomes very tribal and violent. Yeah. Anyway, so obviously I haven't rehearsed or thought about what I was going to say about this book, but yeah, I found it incredibly moving and really interesting, and yeah, I was so happy that I got to see her speak about it too, because she's so incredibly intelligent and just socially engaged and wonderful. And then, aside from prize books, I read what I think is probably one of my favorite novels of the year so far, which is Damian Barr's debut novel, You Will Be Safe Here. And I have to make a confession, like I sort of know Damian personally, like not hugely well, but sort of met him a number of times throughout, just living in London and encountering him at different occasions. And he's quite big on the literary scene because he hosts this very glitzy and wonderful literary salon where he interviews different authors. He's interviewed so many famous authors, and I've talked about this literary salon before. So I had huge amounts of expectations for this book, and I was sort of nervous going into it because it's always slightly nerve-wracking reading a book by an author that because what if you don't like the book? Then you have to sort of awkwardly be like, sorry, it just didn't work for me, or sometimes just like make an excuse and say oh, I haven't got around to reading the book, and just lie and defer it until they stop asking if you've read it yet. But yeah, I was so happy. I just fell into this book immediately and connected with the story and really got into it and just loved it. I thought it was so beautifully done and really powerful. So it's a dual narrative where the first half of the book is about a woman living on it sort of starts when she's living on a farm in South Africa in 1900 or around that time. And it's the start of the Second Boer War, which is this big battle where the British came in and basically took over and told the Boers that they couldn't control or run the country. And I don't know much about this battle myself or the history of this battle. So it starts with her story, and the British come to her farm and basically decimate the farm, burn it, and take her away into a camp, which is a concentration camp. And I hadn't realized this about this war and that the British actually implemented and used concentration camps as a military strategy during the Boer Wars before World War II and Hitler, and I think a lot of people just assume that concentration camps are like an invention of the Nazis. But yeah, it was used by the British before this, and I hadn't known about this before reading this novel, which is an incredible fact, and was so tragic. And thousands of civilians who were herded into these concentration camps died, not so much through extermination, but because they out of disease, and they were horribly overcrowded and misrun and very poorly run, and so it's incredible reading about that, and it really brings you inside that experience, which is really heartrending and awful, and shows the reality of what it was like in one of these concentration camps. But then also the second half of the story and second half of the novel is about a young man in the present time in 2010, or close to the present time in 2010, who's taken to a camp which is sort of a military camp, which is sort of supposed to straighten out men that are a bit effeminate or who don't fit into this idea of masculinity. And they're put through these military training procedures, which are really torturous. But then the boys are actually tortured as well when they break the rules or don't live up to it. And so yeah, two quite like different stories. And the way he connects these two stories is really inventive and interesting. Like I wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but he pulls it off so well. And yeah, and it's sort of showing how there are different forms of oppression, and how there are these different institutions which are made by governments or by small groups of fanatics, people who are, and these institutions are purportedly for the safety or the betterment of people that are trapped there, that are incarcerated there, but in reality they are being tortured there and held there against their will, and yeah, it's so very horrible. But it's also about the changing politics of South Africa over a century, and how there's this, been such a shifting idea of what a South African identity is. And so it's so fascinating how he does this. But also, it's another novel that has a real lightness of touch, I think, in that as you're reading it, you're aware of these bigger issues, but you're, at the moment of reading it, you're just inside their story. And he gives such wonderful details about their lives and their actions. And so the boy who's taken to this camp in the year 2010, he's very bookish, and so and very quiet and reserved, and is just aware of being different. And so personally, I think is very relatable in that way, and I could really relate to him and understand his story. And and it's just wonderful how he's done it. But also the wife and the mother in the year 1900, when she's taken to the concentration camp, felt like I really understand her perspective as well and relate to it in an odd way, even though obviously her life is so different from my own. And yeah, so just love this story so much, and think it's an incredible novel. So I hope a lot of people read it, and I hope it's just been published. I hope it gets a lot of award recognition. And then finally, very briefly, because I've been talking a long time, although this is a huge subject, I finally read this novel. No, it's not a novel. It's a book of nonfiction, basically an extended essay by Margo Jefferson about Michael Jackson, called On Michael Jackson. And I read this because, I've been wanting to read it recently, as I talked about recently in a TBR video I made about Black History Month. But yeah, I wanted to read this because I watched the first part of the Michael Jackson documentary recently. And yeah, it's part of me didn't want to watch that documentary because, I knew it would be so horrible and difficult hearing these men's stories talking about how Michael Jackson abused them. And and this is such a big subject because it's such a huge controversy. And Michael Jackson has his defenders on one side saying that these men are lying about their childhood experiences being abused by Michael Jackson. And then other people are saying, well, no, we have to listen to these men and believe their stories. And Michael Jackson was a pedophile and a monster who, and I know some people have watched this documentary now and don't listen to his music anymore. And, and I feel like everyone is forced to come to have an opinion about it and say, did he do it or not? And, and partly, like, I just feel like, well, that's not really for me to decide or any of the general public to decide, because this is a legal issue and it should be decided in courts, But there's a whole other big issue. It's like, well, could Michael Jackson ever get a fair trial? And, he was tried continuously for different accusations of child molestation. And because he was such a major celebrity, so can someone like that ever get a fair trial? And so, yeah, there's so many issues to do with it. But and then there's a bigger issue of like, well, can you separate the artist from their art? And, and that whole issue. And Margo Jefferson deals with a lot of this in this book, and looks at the Jackson family and really links it into a cultural tradition of African American performers throughout time, and how Michael Jackson fits into that in some ways, and in other ways, was a complete groundbreaking, someone who really like reinvented what could be done as a pop star. And so, yeah, it was so interesting seeing this different perspective and thinking about this big, complex issues. And I don't have any answers or to what it was, obviously. But yeah, it was really interesting to read this and think about that. So that was my reading for this month. Yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books, what you think about them. If you're reading any of the books from the prize lists, I'd be really interested to know your perspectives on all these books. Yeah, or if I've piqued your curiosity, if you're interested to read any of them now. And if you want to know more of my thoughts about them, like as always, I'll put links in the description to my full reviews of these books, because there's a lot more to say about all of them, even though I've been talking for so long. So thank you for watching. I hope your reading month is going well. Hope you're staying healthy and avoiding the colds which have been going around, and staying positive if you live in Britain in the face of all this Brexit chaos that we're having. So I'll speak to you again soon, and hope you're doing well, and happy reading, everyone. Bye-bye.